Thank you all for joining me here today. Have any of you heard of AirDNA, our small company? Is anyone in the audience? A smattering. Well, it's good to know someone has heard our small name. So we're a small startup. We started 3 years ago in a garage in California. Our idea as Airbnb hosts, my partner and I, was that there was no information out there for hosts to understand how to price their properties, what to do with their properties, what should their cleaning fee be. There was no information at all. So we started picking up data by scraping Airbnb in our home markets of Santa Monica, California, where he was, and London, where I was at the time. But this slowly evolved into a much more industrial operation as we wanted to help out other hosts and start putting reports together to help out other Airbnb hosts. But then when we realized the market was so much larger than what we thought, that hotels were interested, tourism boards were interested, academics was really interested to see how Airbnb was changing communities. So today I'm doing a small presentation on looking through our data set, what has been surprising things that have happened in different markets around the world as a result of Airbnb. So let me move on. So let's just turn to Airbnb a little bit, because at conferences like this, Airbnb gets a really hard time. Hoteliers are very upset with what Airbnb is doing to their industry. Traditional people in the tour operators have a hard time. But we must remember that Airbnb is but not even 10 years old. And I feel everyone in this mature and established travel industry is giving Airbnb a hard time beyond what they deserve. They have empowered people to take short-term vacations into the urban environment and made a different way of being able to have a holiday. And I see that the people who complain about Airbnb, they increasingly seem like a group of sailors who are complaining about the sea, because Airbnb is here to stay, and for the rest of the tourism industry, or short-term rentals is here to stay. Everyone else needs to think, how is this going to fit into this ecosystem that has changed from what we were used to? So Airbnb is not something to fear, it has to be something that one has to embrace now, because that is the reality going forward. So the first market I'd like to look at is Shanghai. So China is a curious market for any non-Chinese company. If one thinks about which companies have really succeeded in China, there's a number of fashion brands, there's Apple, and almost nobody else. The big American tech companies like Google, Facebook, Uber, they've had no traction at all in China. So what Airbnb has recently managed to achieve is really quite impressive. So we can see here on this chart here, up on that axis on the left is the year-on-year growth of in each city, in a selection of cities around the world, and the axis at the bottom is how many listings there are. So we can see of mature markets, Shanghai is still having explosive growth compared to other markets that are slowly maturing. And we could look into the timeline of this, that Airbnb really started to get serious just over a year ago. It spun off its entity into something separate, and it took the care and the understanding to know that to succeed in China, you need a name that will work in the Chinese market. So you can see this growth rate continues to really fly off. And it really is remarkable that someone has managed to open the Chinese market in the way they have, because you can see just by the number of listings, the average number of listings in 2017 is very similar to Cape Town, to Berlin, to mature markets. So Shanghai is, and the Chinese market is not falling behind as one would ordinarily expect. It's become a real boon in the Shanghai economy. So this is very unusual for an American tech company to have that achievement. Next, let's go to Kyoto. So Kyoto is, and Japan has been an extraordinarily popular travel destination lately. And Kyoto is such a curious one because at this point here, the laws in Kyoto changed to suddenly allow, and as far as I'm aware, the only city in Japan that's taken this step, that properties can be rented for up to 180 days a year on Airbnb. So this caused, in 1 month, a 320% growth in the number of listings in the area. So an extraordinarily change from just earlier when, in February 2016, when the number was far smaller. And what this has really done is allow Kyoto to cope with the enormous demand there has been for travel in Kyoto recently, because we still see a typical hotel around Kyoto Station is still achieving 95% occupancy. It still has strong ADR, strong RevPAR, but the Airbnbs have come in and they've mopped up the excess demand. One also thinks that because these new travel options available, Kyoto, historically a pricey hotel market, even at the budget end, well over $100 a night, is receiving more visitors than it ever would if it wasn't for the existence of Airbnb. And that growth continues to roll upwards. But Kyoto is not Japan. There are, in Osaka, we can see quite a different story. So Osaka has a lot more maturity as an Airbnb market, and we can see down here, this is the hotel performance typically in Osaka at this time. And generally, occupancy is rising, ADR is rising, RevPAR is rising over recent years. It shows no real impact of the input of Airbnb. So these hotels are not hurting in the way you might expect, because they the market for tourism to Osaka has remained good. It's become something of a food capital. But more surprisingly, we don't see this in many other places, that Airbnbs are doing much worse than they used to. Well, much worse. You can see that ADRs, RevPARs are both falling in this market. And this is what maybe we can see at the future of a mature market. So when Airbnbs they've come into the market, they've had their extraordinary growth rates of the past, and now it's settled in to be part of the tourism ecosystem. And there aren't many new properties coming on the market. It's not displacing housing in perhaps the way people might have thought before. So this is perhaps a glimpse into the future of other markets, that when Airbnb flatlines, it can become a viable alternative to the existing hotel accommodation. And this is something we really find with monitoring the numbers of Airbnbs in different cities, that every city really is different. It has its own background, its own historical thoughts on how Airbnb has developed. And each city tends to have a different approach to whether they think this is a good thing or a bad thing. So often we read in the newspapers about the scandal of Airbnb forcing local people off the land, forcing hotels out of business. But what we see in most cities is nothing like this. The cities that get all the attention, where our office is based, Barcelona, in New York, in San Francisco, these super popular cities that have enormous strains regardless of Airbnb coming into the marketplace. And Airbnb is often used as a scapegoat in these popular cities for why they haven't built more houses, they haven't done more to cope with their popularity. And Airbnb, the foreign invader, is one that is so easy to attribute blame to. But when you look at the vast majorities of cities out there, normal cities, not holiday destinations, not achingly cool capital cities to go and see, they really provide viable alternative accommodation options that weren't available before. So as we go on to our next example, we're going to come back to New York. So Iceland is such a curious example of how Airbnb is developed. So Iceland, as I'm sure you all know, particularly after 2008, when they had their own financial difficulties, became an enormously popular tourist destination. The airlines helped out by offering free stopovers. It's such a curious culture. It feels like you're the end of the world. It's such a unique touristic experience that demand has really grown in these areas. However, the traditional lodging market has no way of coping with these kind of advances in demand. So we can see the international visitors grow, but also the growth is not just to Reykjavik, it's out to the countryside as well. So we can see on these charts how Airbnb has stepped in and enabled this popularity of rural Iceland to come into the marketplace. So these charts on the left are showing the top one is supply, so total available rooms. And you can see that hotels in the northeast region of Iceland have been unable to do anything about this influx of demand because it takes a long time to plan and build a hotel. And in the northeast of Iceland, an area that was really struggling after the financial crisis that Iceland went through, when its currency fell through the floor, when it defaulted on its loans, really needed to get some income from somewhere, and bringing tourism to northeast Iceland really kept parts of the culture and parts of that island alive and stopped them from wasting away. And it was Airbnb that enabled all these extra visitors to come to the area who otherwise would not have. So you can see this top chart is the rooms, the bottom chart is available properties, which of course makes it look all the more stark when comparing with hotels. And then we can see in Akureyri, apologies to the Icelandic crowd in the corner there. So we can see a map here of the hotels in that city and the Airbnbs in that city. And we can see how without the provision of Airbnbs, it wouldn't be able to support this kind of demand. So this was a surprising finding, and we actually worked with a hotel group who was looking to see Airbnbs as a precursor of where they should build a hotel. Where's getting fashionable? Where are people looking to visit? Because a hotel takes a while to build, whereas Airbnbs respond to demand very quickly. It can be that real invisible hand of the market to find out where is coming up next, where is going to be popular next. And if you look at where Airbnb visitors are rising and where they're appearing, then so you can start to plan your hotels. The same thing when we've worked with many of the DMOs to have been very curious about Airbnb, and we've worked with them to really identify where the visitors actually staying in the city. Because if we take an example of New York, which we'll get to momentarily, historically, you want to stay in New York, nearly all the hotel supply was in Midtown New York, around Times Square. Maybe not the most beautiful part of New York, but as the popularity of Brooklyn rose, of Williamsburg rose, there was no way to monitor how this was happening, but this is where people wanted to travel to, particularly a younger, more hipster audience. Williamsburg became the capital of cool around the world, and there were no hotels. I think there were 2 hotels there of any standard, and this is where Airbnb stepped into the breach to be able to get people to experience Williamsburg. So when we look at New York City, they took the regulatory path of banning Airbnbs, all short-term rentals. And that's not entirely true. There's always been corporate apartments, long stays, but the idea of this touristic license was rejected. Yet they have been completely unable to bring down the Airbnb goliath because so many people want to stay in Airbnbs and so many local New Yorkers want to provide Airbnbs. So I think this shows the point that I spoke about before, that the traditional hotel tourist industry can't just say, let's get rid of it. We need to go back to when a time there was when there was no Airbnb, because this is impossible because the demand is out there amongst the populace. So we ran some analysis on maybe what New York is missing out on, because a really common complaint amongst the traditional tourism industries is Airbnbs aren't paying their taxes. But of course, if you ban it, there is no way of them paying their taxes. So in Chicago, they have a tax position where they have a 4% room rate and an additional 4.5% Airbnb rate. So there's an 8.5% tax on rooms. if New York City did the same thing, they would bring in $62 million into their coffers. And this is something that the travel organizations of the world could use to further promote and manage the city. By having a well-streamed regulatory system, you can have so much more control about these Airbnbs. When we've compared different regulatory approaches, we've seen definitely the most successful is make it very easy to register, make the initial tax burden very reasonable, don't make it 25%, don't make it so you have to go to the council, you have to go to City Hall, you have to get 7 things stamped before you can register. Make a nice, smooth online registration system, one we saw effectively implemented in New Orleans, and then from there you've got nearly the entire ecosystem under your control, and then you can consider, well, do we want to stop having licenses? Maybe we can withdraw some licenses, but it's all controlled. But its outright banning effect is not only depriving New York of $62 million a year, it's also making the entire Airbnb system in the black world, in the grey world, and unable to be controlled. So let's move on. So this is the last area to consider, because there is a very unfortunate side to Airbnb, and this is the super popular areas where Airbnbs could almost take over. So these 2 areas we highlighted here, these are the areas, by our data, has the most Airbnbs per square kilometre in the world. And 53 Airbnbs in 6 years is an extraordinary number. And if you think about the size of this hall and put it in square kilometers and just try and really think about what it means to have that many Airbnbs in that town, it can really be a takeover. Now, particularly in Sayulita and other markets like Bali, the emergence of all these Airbnbs, well, they were holiday villas for tourists anyway, so you have to consider what has just changed the platform which they're on, rather than these are new houses driving out local people. And the other thing you also must consider that towns like Caton in Italy were typically places you day trip. So you come from your other base in the area around that part of Italy, you take a day trip, you take a picture, you'd have a nice time on the beach there, and then you disappear. So you do have the advantage of people really staying longer and appreciating the town. But that is the dark side of Airbnb, that towns like this, they can feel overwhelmed when there's no regulatory presence at all. Local people can see the money they can make renting out in the short term versus the long term, and it can go something out of control. So those are the 5 markets I wish to speak about. Does anyone have any questions for me about the data we see or AirDNA in general? Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tom.